Okay, do we have sound now? I guess we didn't have sound, but hopefully we have sound now. So thank you for waiting for that. Anyway, we're talking about a new parable that Jesus is teaching, which is a story about Jesus's concept of leadership. So he's talking about two leaders that are going to be examples of what, in Jesus's esteem, good leadership looks like. There's going to be one that's a good one, and there's going to be one that's a bad one. And I think this is one of the more important conversations right now, especially when we're dealing with leadership and voting on those people in our society right now. These are important things to consider. And I want to walk through this passage and talk a little bit about what Jesus is saying. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual verses. So the first one is we get this introduction that the master of the house or of a large farm or ranch is somebody basically who's an owner with several servants. And remember, in this day and age, in ancient Israel at this time, the servant was an individual who gave over their rights of ownership and of really a freedom to do whatever they wanted to become a servant of the household there. Now, this was a volitional choice, meaning that they weren't thrown into slavery or into a slavery position, but they were offered themselves as servants, either to pay a debt or to because they didn't have enough money to care for themselves. So at that point, the owner becomes in charge of their lives, of their stability, and feeding them and caring for them. So in this analogy, we're getting a setup. The owner of this house, we'll say, is leaving for a little bit. He's taking off, and he's put somebody in charge. And it says he put a servant in charge of the other servants. And I love the fact that he uses the term servant here and doesn't say that he hired an outside person, but it's really interesting that he places one of the servants in charge of their fellow servants. And then he sets up this dichotomy, these two different ways of looking at leadership. I want to walk through what that looks like. So the first one he claims is faithful, it says, which is another word for loyal, or somebody who is committed to what they said they were going to commit to, and is also wise, meaning they understand the consequences of their choices and of their decisions, and they know that being a good servant and doing what they're supposed to do is essentially going to mean that they're going to have a good reward as a result of it. It's simple logic, you would seem, but we're going to see in the next person that they didn't see it that way, and so they were considered bad. So right now we have this good person in charge, and the master or the household, we'll even say CEO, right, has put their employee in charge of the other employees. And this person is responsible for feeding them and basically for caring for them, their daily needs. And this servant does that. It's not rocket science. It's not, magic. It's just being a good person, doing what they said they would do, and doing the work. And one of the things I want to point out here is that he never says leader. He never says as this person is placed in leadership. He's a servant placed in charge of serving servants. And this is something that is like foundational to Jesus's teachings, which I absolutely adore, and I think as a human being is a fantastic way of looking at leadership as being not people who we esteem because they're powerful, but we esteem and we hold them up because they serve us, because they place themselves in that humble position to help others. Now we have the wicked servant, right? So this is the person that Jesus is setting up to be a bad character, and the word here for bad is essentially this general term that essentially is the widest possible sense of saying the term bad. So this is essentially good versus bad. Now this particular servant says to himself, you know what? The CEO's away, the leader's away, the master of the household is away, and while the cat's away, the mice will play. And so he decides to start living in luxury and basically beating these other servants. Now we're not sure why he's beating these servants, but I will talk about why Jesus suggests that he's beating them, because Jesus is going to be beaten himself as a servant of God. And then it says that this wicked servant also engages in drunkardness, or hangs out with those who are drunkards. One of the key distinctions that I want to point out in this particular story that I think really plays into our modern society as human beings is the difference between somebody who is placed in power, who does what they said that they would do, and who serves the people that he or she are put in place in power of, and then the other who uses that position of power to exercise and lord that power over others, to punish those that this leader feels like punishing whenever they want to, but also uses the resources that he or she has been given for their own luxury. That's one of the key distinctions in this that I want to point out. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a couple of minutes as we get to the end. But then I want to talk about how Jesus wraps this story up. So the owner comes back, and Jesus makes a point of saying that he comes back at an hour that's not known. In other words, the master or the CEO, whoever it is, essentially wants to surprise this leader. They want to get a real picture of what it looks like and what their leadership is really like without them, preparing for the return of the leader or of the CEO or the master. I love this little TV series. I think it's called Undercover Boss, and actually Corrigan's the one who loves it the most, introduced me to it. And it's this idea of the CEO who takes on a position of a low-level employee in their own company and sees how things are run and works under the leadership of his or her own employees. And it's a fascinating look into corporate America, but also into the idea of leadership and what makes a good leader and how that leader serves and provides for and instructs their employees. So I love that concept that this is a big surprise. And when the leader gets back, clearly the difference is he comes back to the good leader and says, you know what, you have done exactly what you said you would do. You fulfilled all of your obligations and responsibilities. And so now I'm going to put you in charge of even more because I can trust you. Then there's the other flip side of that Jesus gives us this picture of somebody that when the master comes back, sees that he is beating his own servants, people that are his comrades, are his equals, and that he's living in a life of luxury based upon elements and food and alcohol that isn't theirs to begin with. And then he says that this master and the CEO or this leader of this house, and it says literally in here, cuts them in two, and then puts them alongside of the hypocrites. And this is where Jesus's whole conversation in this context is really poignant and really offensive to his current leaders, his own religious leaders of the day. The reason why he points this out, and the reason why he says being put in charge or being put in the same group as the hypocrites, where basically they're thrown into Gehenna, which is that garbage fire that we've talked about before. The reason he's saying that is because he is setting up an example that everybody knew. These wicked servants who were put in leadership are the Pharisees. These are the religious leaders of Jesus' day. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. These are the people who were put in charge of serving the people of Israel. And notice that these Pharisees and these leaders aren't considered to be above the other servants, but in fact they're the same, just another servant who was placed in a responsible position over their servants. And so Jesus is making a very clear point to the people of his day, to the audience who's listening to him. Look, when God comes back, when the ultimate judgment falls upon these people, the most severe punishment, really the only punishment, are dealt out to those individuals who said they would do something responsible, who said that they wanted to step up into this position of leadership, but who ultimately did not do what they said they were going to do, who ultimately used that position for their own luxury and off the backs and off the suffering of other people. So how does this apply to us 2,000 years removed, right? For us as human beings, what does it mean for us right now? This is an incredibly useful teaching for us as human beings on leadership. When we look at our own leaders, when we consider our own individuals who are in our society, whether that's political, whether that's religious or social, looking for leaders who, when they step into these positions, will recognize these opportunities as a way to serve others. That is a good leader. Today, many of our ministers have seen their position of power over their congregation as a way to exercise authority over others, to chastise and to punish individuals in their congregations who, for whatever reason, don't fit their own particular purity laws. And we have plenty of examples of that, individuals who are thrown out of their own household as young people because they don't fit the mold, or they can't fit the purity ideas that are delivered by this minister. All the while, this minister is living in luxury compared to the rest of his congregation or her congregation. They're living in luxury, they have a nice house, they have nice cars, they eat as much as they want, and in many cases they're drinking just as much as any alcoholic would out there. I'm sad to say that's the case, but I've seen it enough to know. And the difference is, when we're looking for our own religious leaders to be good leaders, to discern who's a good one and who's not, we need to look to whether they are serving the lowest of our societies, those who are truly in need, the poor, the homeless, those who are without, widows, orphans. These types of people, are these people being served by their ministry? Or are they serving themselves in luxury, in ease, and essentially drawing lines of purity in order to make others suffer on for their own behalf, actually? Second on this point are our own politicians. I don't need to name any names. I don't, because I remain politically, I don't align myself with a political cause or political people, because my ministry is in building common ground with humans. So I have given up that right of my own in order to be able to talk to as many people as possible. But when we look at our leaders, I still can at least acknowledge that when we are trying to decide which one is a good leader and which one is a bad leader, just like when we looked at our religious leaders, we can look at our political leaders and ask ourselves a question. Do they see themselves as the servants of all of us? In their position, do they take care of those of us who are the least, those of us who are suffering? Do they have concern for the poor, for the homeless, for the sick, for the orphans, for the widows, for the people who are truly suffering? Are they serving them? And second, are they serving themselves? Do they use the money from our taxes and from the people of this country, for instance, in the US, do they use that money to help others who are suffering, again, or do they use that money for their own comfort, their own luxury, and their own ease? Last, it's the same with our own corporations. It doesn't take much for us to see those CEOs who live in excessive luxury and just absolutely ridiculous amounts, hoarding money to an extreme. And while their own employees are suffering on basically the lowest possible income, the lowest possible benefits package. Is it possible and is it legal for them to do this? Yeah, it is, absolutely. Is it good? No, I don't believe it is, because it causes suffering, and that will always lend itself to social unrest eventually. I want to close with this thought. It's often difficult for us to decide which leader is a good leader and which one is not. So many times they provide for us. They're good speakers. They put on a good show. They look like a leader. They act like a leader. But when it comes down to it, we really have only a couple of things that we should look to. Do they serve the least of us? Or do they serve themselves? I appreciate you joining me on this particular conversation. This story was written 2,000 years ago by Matthew, who was recording the story as Jesus told it. But our humanity has not changed in all of that time. And we still have to deal with leaders who use their positions of power to indulge in their own luxury. I might ask you to consider, as you're voting, for instance, to think about this as well. To think about what a good leader should look like and what a bad leader looks like. And for those of us who are looking for churches or religious leaders, to consider the same. Do they care about the least of us more than themselves? I want to thank you for joining me. If you have any comments, I would absolutely love it if you would put the comments below the video so that we can learn from each other. You are the only person who is able to think that way that you are able to. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'd also ask that you like my Facebook page. And if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, there's a button right down here to click that says subscribe. Would love it. That way we can stay in contact with each other. And there's some super exciting things coming up, new programs that are going to be coming your way. And I'm really excited about all that. But most of all, I'm excited to be here with you. And I'm so grateful for your presence in this whole process as I continue to try to grow as a human being alongside of you. Until tomorrow, live at noon, I want you to know that I love you. And I hope you choose to love yourself. It is the only love that we have any control over in this world. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving our neighbors, those around us, the same way. Thank you.